And I know it's the last talk. I'm sure everybody's ready to go to happy hour, but I want to say a real quick thank you to Big Elixir and the team. It was a great conference. Everybody had fun, right? I don't know, Brian. Brian, they don't sound like they had fun. Did everybody have fun? Yeah. I mean, I see the numbers have dropped a little bit from yesterday. It looks like it's more like 25,000 now, Todd. What are you thinking? Something, give or take a few thousand? As Brian said, I'm Johnny Winn. I'm host of the Elixir Fountain podcast. I'm also a senior software engineer at Weedmaps. I work with Todd sometimes. And I'm here today to talk about something like a little pet project that I've been working on, and it's actually a few years in the making. It's about creating life processes with Elixir. Now, I'm sure you're all kind of curious. Oh, by the way, real quick, if you have internet, I'm not sure if you do, there's the link to the project. You can pull it up. I will have the notes when I show code. There will be actually the link to the code that's on there, just in case you can't see it. Just try to be helpful because the code is on with a black background. So let's see, what are we going to talk about? So first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the experiment, what the project is, and why I care about it, at least. Hopefully you care about it. I'm going to talk to you about some of the rules that I had to encounter, some of the problems that I had to solve that didn't have anything to do with OTP, but just trying to figure out with these types of projects, things that need to be sought after. So, and then finally, I'm going to build the playground and kind of show you some of the OTP structures that I used, and I'll tell you a little bit about why I used them. Let's start with the experiment. So it's a genetic experiment. So the idea is that the application runs, it throws food in a Petri dish. The Petri dish then, you can populate it with seed organisms, and then they start kind of living life. First, they just kind of move around until they start getting hungry, and then once they get hungry, they start seeking out food, and then once they're well-fed and ready to go, they're ready to mate. And so then they're looking for other organisms to mate with, and then they spawn new organisms, and eventually they either all die or we'll see what happens. Just so you know, when I start this, I'm going to start it and I'm going to show it to you, and then we're going to let it run while the presentation is going. We'll check in periodically with it to see how things are going. I've run this experiment several times. Sometimes it's really successful. Sometimes it ends up all being the exact same organism moving around because of the way the reproduction works. So why genetics? Well, I did mention that I have kind of a history with this project. So a few years ago, I worked on a project and did a talk similar. I called it Viva La Evolution. And basically what it was it was using processes to spawn up life, but I'm no CSS developer. So I really didn't know how to work the front end. I'm not even a 2D game developer. I don't even play one on TV, and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn last night. So we come to the case of pollination. Basically, organisms would exist, and then they would throw up essentially pollen in the air, and then they would collect and then create new organisms. And it was really interesting, but I always felt like there was like a next step that we could take. And then enter live view. Live view is great. I can just run everything in the background and throw data back at the front end, and then it'll appear. But my curiosity with genetics kind of stems from a little bit about my history. Are there any Elixir Fountain listeners out there? Wow, I feel rejected now. Go check it out. It's a good show. But if you haven't heard, I have 7 kids. My wife and I have a yours, mine, and ours scenario where she had 2, I have 3. This is a big chunk of them. And yes, that is my granddaughter right there in the belly, and now I have a 6-month-old granddaughter. And if you want to know what it's like to be the youngest boy of a bunch of girls, this is my son, AJ. He actually hates taking photos is the problem. Well, he hates taking photos like this. He loves taking photos like when we go places and he can do a pose or something like that, but when everybody wants him to act serious, this is the look we get. So with that being said, you know, all of us, we all kind of look alike, even the stepkids and like my kids, that my wife has blue eyes, I have blue eyes, my stepkids have blue eyes, my kids have blue eyes. So when we go together as a group and you see 9 people with really blue eyes, it kind of freaks people out a little bit. But it's interesting that like my stepkids and I aren't related, but if you go back to this picture, so can you tell which one's my stepdaughter? Anyone? Anyone? Nobody? All right, it's the pregnant one. So that is my stepdaughter. The other 4 girls are my daughters, and then my son. My stepson is not shown in this. They range from 23 to 9, by the way, if anybody's curious. So back to our little experiment. So it's kind of curious that, like, even though we're not blood related, we're not genetically related, we have similar traits, because really, if you see my wife and I next to each other, we kind of have similar traits. We have the same color hair, we have the same color eyes, all this kind of stuff. So it's just kind of interesting when you start playing around with genetics. So that brings us to our project. Now, I'm going to switch over here for a second so I can show y'all. How do I get? How is that going to work? Okay. Hello, little world. All right, so I actually have a timer on there so you can kind of see, because everything's time-based on here. So food gets delivered at a particular rate. You can actually adjust that. We'll talk a little bit about that more. You can have a max food count, so that's how much food you want to put in at a time. But like I said, it's staggered, so it drops in food here and there. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and click that, because it takes a little while for food to come. But you can also seed it with a set number of organisms, so you can say, we're going to start with 10, just because that seems to be the number that I've found that actually produces enough to have some diversity in the gene pool, but not so many that it overpopulates too quickly. So there's our food starting to be there, and actually before that, you'll notice that some of the food drops off after a certain amount of time, because food spoils, right? So if we go ahead and start our generator, check out them CSS skills. Oh yeah. They're dots, but hey, they're dots and they're moving around, right? So if you notice, they're kind of bumbling around a little bit right now, because they just got born, so, you know, but they're in the Petri dish, they're staying in the Petri dish. Sometimes they run into each other and kind of collapse all over each other. Now they're starting to eat food. They're starting to get hungry. Yep, I see a few of them consuming now. So that is the project that we're going to be kind of keeping an eye on for a while. Let me go back to here. Let that run. So what are the kind of problems that I had to solve? Now, I mentioned that I'm not a 2D game designer, so like I said, I don't even play one on TV. So I had to kind of think, well, what are the kind of problems that I'm going to have to solve? Well, one of them was nearest neighbor. I have to find out how to make these things move around. That nearest neighbor algorithm, if you're familiar with it, there's several different ways you can do it. I chose the simplest, but I'm going to show you how that was interesting. Once I know where people are, I have to figure out a trajectory. I have to make sure that I'm moving in the right direction to where I'm hitting those people, or if I'm hitting either that, or if I'm looking for food, I have to go for food. But now the problem is once I get there, how do I know that I'm there? I have to solve for collision detection. But collision detection can be kind of complicated, because it's not just running into another organism or food, it's also running into walls. There's walls to the Petri dish. Another thing that I had to deal with was fitness. Now, fitness, if you're familiar with genetic algorithms, you tend to apply a fitness algorithm to say, this is the fittest organism, so I'm trying to, or the fittest thing, so I'm trying to move towards that. So what you do is you actually say, okay, here's the fitness. If you notice, I think we had strength selected. So each trait is set up. So strength means they're larger. The larger ones are usually stronger organisms. More stamina means they can go longer without eating. So you can actually select stamina. And speed is another trait that you can select in here. To where, color's another one, but I didn't actually put it on there because it didn't fit really well in the slide, and I wasn't sure how it was going to show on the screen. But so you could actually set the color. So if there's a preferred color, organisms will go looking for that preferred color. So, getting into these problems, nearest neighbor. I just went linear. I said, all right, tell me where everything is in the thing and who's closest. When you think about it, if there's only like 2 or 3 organisms in the, or 2 or 3 organisms or even 2 or 3 food items in the Petri dish, it's not that hard because there's only a couple of things to check for. But when you're talking about, say, thousands of processes running, that might take a long time to try to figure that out. But here's the algorithm basically that I used. And if you'll notice, it's kind of clunky, and I did that on purpose. You can check it out at nearest_neighbor.ex if you're following along at home. But basically what you have to do is you have to figure out the distance between those 2 objects, and then when you run it through a list, you get a list of everybody, and you sort that list, and then you take the one that's the closest. Now, Elixir gives us some handy things to be able to do that with, to do it fast at least. So the Petri dish actually contains all the organisms, so you get and food, and so you get everything. And then based on whether or not you're hungry, you're looking for food. So you're trying to find only the food organisms, or the food that's in the tree, or in the Petri dish. Or if you're ready, I was nice, I just said ready, they look for mates. So, and then of course, because it's a mating, you have to apply the fitness match. So you calculate whether or not the fitness is the correct organisms, because you're going to gravitate towards organisms that are the fittest. Now, there's task.async stream. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it basically builds the tasks as streams. And so when you run enum, everything runs through streams, so you're basically simultaneously kind of doing all the things at once. It allows you to really quickly pull that setback. And then, of course, you just take you have the first organism. Now, you'll notice there's the like OKs, because that's the way that it returns the data, an OK with the data that was applied through the task. Well, so now I know where everything is, and I know how far it is away, and I know, now that I know how far it is away, I can know what I want to get to, but how do I know how to get there? Well, in steps are trajectory. So I talked about speed. So speed is the number of steps it's going to take to get to another organism. So I know, based on the speed, or steps, how fast I can get there. Now, obviously, you can see problems with this. If I take the whole trajectory at one time, and I commit that, well, what happens when that organism moves? Food stays in the same place, except when it's eaten by something else that was closer. So we have to figure that out. This gets a little bit more complicated, but we have to figure out what the distance is and then how many steps it's going to take. And then all we do is we grab the first step, because that's the only thing we can do. You always have to start with the first step, right? So you take that first step, and it moves us closer to that object. Now, if that object is an organism, the organism is going to change. So every time you move, you're going to check it again and say, is it still the closest? How far is it away? And so you see this like funny behavior, like sometimes because it's a really fast one, it'll jump really quick to it, and then it kind of slows down because it has to figure out an X number of steps to get to it. So it's still a little clunky, but they're moving around. All right, fitness. I have to admit, I kind of punted on this. Fitness algorithms are a little bit, they can be very complicated. So what I did was I boiled it down to basically, if the fitness is stamina, you're trying to find something that's either stronger or at least equal to what you are. If it's stamina, it's somebody that has stamina, you know what I'm saying. Essentially, it boils down to you're trying to find something that's either better than you are or at least equal to what you are. Now we get to collision detection. The first part of collision detection is kind of interesting just because you basically have to figure out, you have a point that you're at, but you have to figure out the radius so that you know the distance, or you know how big you are, and then you have to take how big you are and how big the other thing is, and what's the distance, and is the distance smaller than your combined radius? Because that means that you have now bumped up against something. This code gets a little cleaner. Now, I could go back and refactor the distance calculation and have it similar to this, but I wanted to show also, as I'm working on these types of projects, a lot of times I do things and I do it kind of ugly first until I kind of work with it a little bit, and then I kind of refine it, and by the time I got to this stage, I was like, okay, I'm gonna cut some corners and kind of clean this up a little bit. But I wanted to show the two different things, because this is all about a playground. This isn't production code. So here our distance, we know where the object is, and now we know where the object is that we want to go to. We know how to get to the object, and we know when we actually reach that object. But there's another type of collision that we could have. What about the walls? So as you're moving around, you also have to figure out where you are in the Petri dish so you don't run into, or if you do run into a wall, you have to be pushed back into the Petri dish. You can't go outside the bounds of it. So it's constantly having to check to see where am I at, and it has to check all four walls so that it knows that I'm okay to, I can still move, or I'm going to run into this wall or that wall. All right. What do you think's happening? Anybody got any clues? I knew I should have brought drinks for everybody. Oh. This happens. We could restart it, but basically, because of the way that the fitness is, and it's looking for particular traits, and as it moves around, when it goes to reproduce, it might run into a pair, and it basically does a random either one or the other color. I could make these colors really complicated and use like hex colors, and then but I figured that's a little overkill for this presentation. Actually, in the genetic one, where I needed to show a little bit more because I wasn't showing colors, I did use hex as the DNA for the organism so that you could see. But this sort of thing still happens depending on the pool size that you're drawing from. Because obviously, if you have a set number of features or traits that you're pulling from, eventually, if you let it run long enough, they'll all be the same, which is kind of weird. Now, if you'll notice, we haven't actually touched OTP yet. All we've done is use functions. You don't always have to go to OTP immediately. Sometimes you need to solve little problems on your way to solving bigger problems. The first thing is I literally picked out a piece of graph paper and did old school math class, drawing out, okay, here's this one, let me write out the formula for distance and all that kind of stuff, and then I figured out how to get it into code. You don't always have to go straight to OTP. Now, OTP is your friend, and it's going to be there to help you, but make sure that you have your functions doing what they're supposed to do without OTP prior to bringing it in. That being said, this is heavily dependent on OTP. So here's our application with our essential base supervision tree. We have a Petri dish, we have the food generator, because something has to actually say, go ahead and build this food. The food supervisor, which is actually a dynamic supervisor that allows me to create transient processes. That's actually going to be my food. Also, the organism supervisor is a dynamic supervisor, so it creates transient processes, because remember, these things spoil, food spoils, and organisms die. The other thing that can happen, depending on if you don't put enough food in these trays, they run out of food and then they starve to death, which I always feel really bad when that happens. But how complicated do we need to be? So our Petri dish is really our stored state for what's happening in the Petri dish. It doesn't really do much of anything other than it can give you a list of everything that's in the Petri dish, and it can draw new things in the Petri dish, which is essentially drawing them to the screen, but it's creating them in the Petri dish, and then removing them from the Petri dish. That's all it's doing. One of the biggest problems I see when people get into OTP is they start having their processes do too many things. They combine both state and functionality in a single process. Well, what happens when your message queues fill up? Because it's essentially like, I think the best way to say it is if Brian was here, and Brian can do a bunch of different things, but if I start handing him messages, and he has to read each message every single time before he can go to the next message, and I just keep bombarding him with messages, what's going to happen? You're not going to die, don't worry, I promise. But if you do, we'll restart you. It's okay, he's supervised. So the idea is to separate what you're trying to do, like actual processes of state versus behavior. If you want to do an action, it's great to have a process that spins up, does a thing, and dies off. That's perfect. Transient processes are great, using dynamic supervisors to monitor those so that you can restart them if need be. That's all functionality that's good. Now, when we get to what's happening in the actual food supervisor and the food generator only has a few functions to it. Now, there's some private functions, but really all the private functions is for helping out with the public API. But here's essentially the functions. The ones without an asterisk are the food generator, and the food supervisor just has generate food. So essentially oh, excuse me, I got that reversed. The food generator has all the information on how to generate food, and the food supervisor generates the food. So essentially when you call begin, it calls into the supervisor and says, here, create this food, and create this food, and then the food supervisor spins those up. Now when we dive in, what is actually food? The only thing food knows is it can receive a message about being consumed. Was I eaten? And internally, there's a timer running that as soon as it gets created, it says, I have X amount of time before I spoil, and then what happens if it spoils, if it's not eaten in time, then it just goes away, and it gets removed from the dish. Now, when we start talking about the organisms, it's pretty similar. The generator really, the main purpose of the generator is to allow us to, through reproduction, we actually call spawn. The begin generation is actually what starts the Petri dish. So when I click the button to say start organisms, it says, okay, I'm going to create a bunch of random organisms and throw them in the Petri dish. And then once organisms reproduce, they actually send a signal to say, hey, spawn this new organism with a combined DNA. But essentially, we boil it down to just a few functions. And all our organism does, the only API it has is a bounce function. It knows when it runs into a wall, the Petri dish says, hey, you ran into a wall, you need to go back. And then the organism decides, okay, well, I'm going to take a step back. Now, I have seen where they get caught against a wall, and they just keep bouncing back and forth for a few seconds, which is always kind of funny. They're not very smart organisms. Now, I know what you're all thinking. We mentioned live view, right? I intentionally leave this to the very end of this because live views is just the presentation. It's not really doing that much. It's allowing me to do back-end processes and deliver information to the front end periodically. The only code that is necessary to produce that Petri dish and keep the organisms moving and everything like that is this. And even some of this is just like seed data. It's literally the mount function that happens when you connect. And then once you connect, it actually sends a signal. You see it up at the top, the send interval. Every few ticks, it goes and it tries to redraw. And the redraw is just say, hey, what's in the Petri dish? Let me put it on the screen. Actually, if you look at the HTML, aside from some stuff that I had to do with like the CSS and things like that, it's basically a div and a div, and that's it. Now, obviously, there's some more functionality that's put into there because I have the little form on the side to where like you can click things and stuff like that, and you can add stuff, which helps right back. But to make the Petri dish, for the longest time, this is all that was there. All right. So, one last time. Let's see if anything is different. No. What's funny is I've run this scenario like a ton of times, and the problem with simulators is that sometimes you're simulating stuff. So sometimes it works great, and you have a huge population that kind of blows up, and then other times you have this, which is just basically a single population of blue dots, apparently strong blue dots moving around, and they're trying to probably keep up with the food. Oh, wow. That was interesting. Sorry. I can actually watch these for quite a bit. Well, it's interesting to me because it's not something that's part of my day job. And I say that because, these experiments are really important. I love the idea of this conference is all about getting you out there and experimenting. It's all about trying to push the boundaries because these are our playgrounds. This is where you get to do things and you have freedom. You can try new things. You can test stuff out. It doesn't have to work because you're not rolling it into production. So really, this gives you the opportunity to really dive into a language. You get to dive into OTP if you're using Elixir or Erlang and really learn how this functionality works so that way you can take that information and apply it back to your day job, and you're going to be much more successful in that. So, like I said, please check out the repo and feel free to run the code. It's been a fun project to work on, and like I said, it's been multi-years. I work on it little bits at a time and kind of go through several different iterations of it. Try running it locally and see if you can have different experiments. See if you can get different simulations. Somebody I was talking to, was it Greg? Francesco, for his senior project, had to do something very similar to this apparently. Francesco Cesarini from Erlang Solutions, one of his, college projects was creating a simulator to replicate life, and I don't know, I just heard about it the other day, so I wonder how successful he was. I'm sure it was probably good. He was also one of the ones that talked to me, speaking of experiments, and we do this at Weedmaps, which is a really good thing to do with your teams, is we do little projects where we set up constraints around the projects. And so it forces people to do things in a different way. One that we did not too long ago was a short URL application that you couldn't use a database, but you had to store it, and you couldn't use Phoenix. I think that was the other big constraint. And so you had to actually use other tools. Some of us use Rax, which is a cool framework if you're interested in checking out some other frameworks. Some people did it with straight plug. We had examples with using agents to store the data. We had the example of just using straight up gen servers, or ETS was another one that was used. So, on one final note, I don't want to keep y'all too long because I know it's the end of the day on a Friday, and I don't know if you've walked up New Orleans, whatever this street is up here, but it's pretty hopping. Funny thing is, there's a lot of stuff to do in New Orleans. I would have never thought it. I got some bad news today, this morning. My grandfather passed. He's kind of the guy that, my parents got divorced when I was young. He kind of, stepped in as a father figure through, most of my, let's just say wild teenage years. And kept me in line, kept me straight. Every time I'd kind of go off the deep end in one direction, he'd pull me back. And he was always there for me, and I appreciate it. And I just want to say thanks. Thanks for the good genes, right? Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And if anybody wants to have a pint tonight, I will be having a pint.
Just one?
I said if anybody, there's a lot of people in here. That's a lot of pints. I mean, I don't want to let anybody down, So.
Does anybody have any questions for Johnny? Okay. Just a question about how the simulation was working. So it looked like they were clustering really fast. Is that because they were like spawning all in one place and then moving apart, or is it because a piece of food would appear and they were all really fast?
Sometimes it's different things. So sometimes it's because they all get hungry at the same time and they're all looking for the closest food. So they all, if they're near each other, the trajectory is kind of the same. So they, next thing you know, they kind of get bumped up against each other. Also, when they reproduce, it's offset. The child is offset, but it's still relatively close. So if it offsets and it's hungry, it's going to try to head to food. And a lot of times, because what I do is every round I reduce the minimum time to reproduction. So there's like a minimum time to reproduction, and it tries to extend it out so that they can go a little while without reproducing. But then as it ticks down, and they're ready to mate, so like it should happen to where they kind of go out. But I mean, it's a simulator, so sometimes it works great, and then other times it tends to cluster. And then when they do, if a lot of them are hungry at the same time, or if they're timers, they're biological clocks, they're all mating at the same time, then you have offspring that produce, and so then you have a lot of things all around each other, and then they're all looking for the same sorts of things. And so I was actually debating on like adding some kind of probably neat to have things like, you know, you can't mate with your parent, so that sort of thing. But I mean, we're talking about cells here, so they don't really care. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you touched on this a little bit, but it's a very impressive piece of work that you put together, but sometimes when you look at something like this, it seems very daunting to actually achieve it, or maybe you're diving into math concepts that are very foreign to you. So do you have any tips to sort of like make little breakthroughs, you know, like to take on something that, say, you think might be more complicated than what you're able to handle?
So this project actually, like, to write it itself only took a couple of days. To plan it, like I said, it's years in the making. Like, it's like little iterative steps, you know, type thing. Like, I'd, you know, spend a little time on it and be like, okay, well, I can get this working like this. A lot of it gets really complicated when you start talking about like the reproduction and like the movement and things like that. It's like, how do you make it make sense? That's probably one of the reasons too why I punted the first time I did the similar talk, where I just said, you know, I'm not even going to worry about that. I'm just going to assume that it's like a plant that pollinates. And so it made it a lot easier to not have to try to track other things down and do it fast. So a lot of times with these types of projects, when you're doing them on your own, break them off into the chunks. You know, like the stuff that you know, don't worry about. It's the stuff that you don't know, that's what you want to dive deep in to get going. So like a lot of the math stuff, I ended up kind of simplifying as much as I could to where I could make it to where, A, I have to get up and talk about it. So I want to make sure that I can understand it enough to talk about it. But the other thing is I don't want to make it so complicated that, you know, when I started looking into some of the algorithms, if I put the code up on the screen, you'd be like, what the hell is that? You know, so it's like, try to find the things that you know, set aside, focus on the smaller chunks that you can break off, and solve one problem at a time. I mean, like, when that list of problems that I had, that's the order I went down. I figured out, how do I want to solve nearest neighbor? How do I want to find things first? And that's the only thing that I focused on. I didn't worry about anything else. And then once I got like that done and like some of the other kind of functionality, you know, I kind of went back, like I knew what to do about the food, but I needed to make the food generate. I needed to do things. So before I put an organism in there, I could create food. And so the food would sit there and populate, and yes, I did spend quite a bit of time watching food populate and then waiting for it to spoil and regenerate food, you know, so. But then once I got that done and I got some of the other steps done, then I could kind of put it together, but just break it off in chunks. I think that's probably the best advice I could give.
All right. Thanks, Johnny.
Thanks.